The brush bristled against the moss fiber, warm tallow flowing into the seam. Praskoviya Filaretovna, Leskova-Korovkina. Praskoviya Filaretovna Leskova stood on the scaffold board in September 1887, the red pine logs square-hewn and golden, the bog-moss core packed tight with the konopatka, caulking iron, now needing the saturator. The beef-and-mutton tallow smelled warm, almost bread-like, as it soaked into the sphagnum stems. She had learned this work from her father, Filaret Korovkin, a plotnik, a master log builder of the Vygovsky, Vygovsky monastery tradition from the Olonets Governorate. He had taught her how to read the seasons and the wood, how to feel the moss compress under the mallet strike, how to know when the tallow had cooled enough. Her mother, Marfa Anikova, had been a valalshitsa, a wool felter, and taught her the rye straw plaster work. But that was a memory lived out before marriage, before emigration, before the Dakota Territory claimed her. Cut backward now to February 1886, and the small room of the Drumheller brothers' bonanza bunkhouse on the James River south of Aberdeen. Tikhon Andreevich Leskov, her husband, lay in a borrowed bed under a thin wool blanket, his breathing shallow and rattled. He had come out to take winter contract-thresh work for the bonanza, $80 against the spring seed debt. The bunkhouse was balloon frame, thin-walled, the kind of structure Lemuel Hoyt Drumheller threw up for the Polish and Norwegian and Russian contract laborers. No insulation, just raw pine sheathing nailed to rough studs. The chimney pulled poorly. The men slept in damp coats. By December, the cold had begun its work. Tikhon's chest had filled with fluid. By February 11th, 1886, his strength had left him. The bunkhouse cold had taken him from her forever. Praskoviya and Andrei, her eldest, then 9 years old, walked the 8 miles into Aberdeen in the pale winter light on February 14th and brought Tikhon home in a borrowed wagon. The lay elder nastavnik, Yosif Demidov, presided over the Old Believer rite in the small Russian molenna, corner shrine, a priestless Old Believer prayer, the dvupersty, two-fingered sign of the cross, the carved vosmikonichny crest, the 8-pointed cross, standing over his grave in the Russian Orthodox corner of the Brown County Immigrant Cemetery. The bonanza never paid the $80. Hezekiah Marsh, Drumheller's bookkeeper, produced a ledger showing $84.50 in alleged boarding charges against the $80 in wages. The estate lay $4.50 in arrears. The worst kind of mathematics, the kind that left a widow with a debt instead of a wage. Praskoviya filed the homestead patent papers in her own name in March 1886. She was not going to wait for Drumheller's ledgers. The 160 acres were hers by law. It was the first piece of America she truly owned. On this evening, 2 years later, in the cabin that Tikhon had begun and she had finished, the cabin with its squared red pine and tamarack logs, its long-leaf full-dovetail corners, its russkaya pech, mass stove rising white plastered on the north wall. She lit the small oil lamp at the Molena corner shrine. The hand-carved copper 8-pointed crosses, the sphagnum icon, the hand-bound chasovnik, prayer book from the Suprassel press in 1869. All these sacred things were here, brought through from the Vyg River, to stand in this cabin on the James River bottomland. The Molenya corner shrine held its own spiritual gravity. She traced one finger along the long leaf dovetail corner, feeling her father's teaching living in her own hands, the deep bevel of the Russian joint locked tight against winter. But the survey stakes came on January 9th, 1888. Surveyor T.B. Lockport wrote out with iron pins and a quitclaim written in legal language. He claimed her southeast 40 acres lay inside the bonanza's intended expansion line, a line that did not exist on any county map. He offered $190, payable in store script at the Drumheller Mercantile. The worst insult of all, store script, not silver or coin. Not currency that held value anywhere but in Drumheller's own till. Not real money, not the kind of payment that could settle a debt. Praskoviya's voice was quiet, in Russian, her weathered hand on Luceria's shoulder. The youngest, 5 years old, watching from the doorstep with her solemn eyes. Her refusal was not dramatic, not loud. It was simply there, the way the cabin itself was there. The pitch-blacked walls holding against the wind, the pech holding its heat, the 4 strata of caulking, clay and ash plaster face, sphagnum moss core, rendered tallow saturator, pine pitch outer skin, holding the cold of the Dakota Territory at bay with perfect engineering. The Aberdeen Daily Pioneer News hit the Aberdeen Post Office on January 4th, 1888. The front page editorial was written by Reuben Marsh, cousin of the bookkeeper Hezekiah Marsh. The headline read, "The Russian Witchwife of the East Bottoms." The article ridiculed the pitch-blacked log walls, barbarous black tar that stains the land like a heathen mark, and the old believer Milena corner shrine, and the bog-moss winter chinking, and heathen Slavonic chants from a barbarian sect that the Russian Empire itself had outlawed. The pejorative spread through 3 other Dakota papers within 9 days. By January 13th, the Saint, Paul Globe, had picked it up. Witchwife. It was not a new word for women who built things the old way, but in the Pioneer News, in print, in a newspaper read in the Mercantile and the Saloon, it was sharp as a winter wind. The clerk, Mr. Tweed, at the Drumheller Mercantile, refused Praskoviya's flour credit on January 6th. He would not meet her eyes. He did not say the reason aloud. The Pioneer News had said it for him. The newspaper lay on the counter next to the flour barrel. Witchwife. On January 8th, the tax assessment surcharge reached the cabin. The Brown County assessor, a Drumheller appointee, had raised Praskoviya's improvements assessment from $50 to $720. Improvements of pagan and unusual character, the notation read. The back tax demand of $58 was due February 1st, or the claim would forfeit. $58 she did not have. The night of January 9th, Surveyor Lockport drove 4 iron section stakes 22 feet inside her claim's southeast corner. A claim line redrawn without her consent or legal standing. Praskoviya found them at dawn. She said nothing. The lay elder nastavnik, Yosif Demidov, saw the stakes. The neighbor, Aksenti Yefimovich Belyaev, Aksenti Yefimovich Belyaev, the cooper and blacksmith, knew what stakes meant. That evening, after dark, they pulled the stakes from the frozen ground and carried them to Drumheller's Bonanza headquarters and left them on the front step as a message. The land has an owner. Aksenti helped Praskoviya count the dried bog-moss bales stacked in the povit, the loft over the small X-Lev, K.H. Lev, animal byre. The byre itself was a Russian design, a low stone and mud structure where the goat Pelageya and the 3 Romanov sheep and the milking cow Marfa would shelter through the winter. The loft above was where hay stored, and where Anna and Lucaria had spread the moss to dry through August and September. 9 bales remained from the September moch-bolotny, sphagnum bog-moss, harvest. The moss had been cut from the bog ground 2 miles north, where the James River slough widened into sedge meadow, the kind of wetland where the water never quite drained, where the mosses had been growing for 10,000 years. Praskoviya had taken Andrei and Anna out with small sickles on their hands and taught them how to harvest carefully so as not to damage the root crowns. Anna, the middle one, 8 years old, had pulled the moss stalks by hand, packing them into burlap sacks, walking them back to the cabin. Aksenti felt the bales. "Bone dry," he said, running his fingers through the golden gray strands. "This will hold the cabin through the cold." The next day, January 10th, Praskoviya walked to the Aberdeen Republican office, 3 miles on foot across the frozen prairie. The editor, Frank Henry Haggerty, was not there, but his wife Mary was at the printing press. The Republican office was small, just 2 rooms, one for printing and one for editorial work. Praskoviya did not speak English fluently. She left a hand-felted wool scarf, the finest she had ever made, with the traditional Old Believer pattern along the edge in indigo and white, on Mary Haggerty's desk. It was a gift to repay a debt. Mary had sent a chest balm in December when Aksenti's wife had taken a fever. Praskoviya had spent 3 days tending her with her grandmother's knowledge of herbs and steam. She did not do debts. She walked back toward the prairie, her apron empty, her mind already on other things. Yellow-Hand Eagle arrived at the cabin at sundown on January 10th. The Yanktonai Sioux elder, Wichasha Zinape in his language, which meant Yellow Hand, came from the Crow Creek Agency 90 miles southwest to trade dried psin, water tuber, and tipsala, tip sila, prairie turnip, cakes. His family and Praskoviya's family had traded for 5 winters. She gave him felted wool socks made from the wool of her Romanov sheep, dyed with walnut hulls and logwood, with patterns of Old Believer geometry. He gave her the tubers and a warning in careful English, his face creased like dried leather in the lamplight. "The Yale man with the elevator," he said. "His fencemen have been about your south line. They have been looking at the corner, carrying papers. You should know this." After he left, Praskoviya took the lamp and walked the entire perimeter of the cabin. She checked the south wall seam by seam, her hand running across the pitch-black surface, feeling for any weakness. The pitch outer face was still intact, glossy black, holding steadfast against the wind. The seams were tight, the dovetail corners, the long-leafed linny-least, Russian dovetail, held their geometry tight. The deep bevel of the Vygovsky longleaf. The cold could not find a passage yet. The barometer bone in Praskoviya's hand, the carved wood scrap her grandmother had given her, which bent more acutely as the air pressure fell, told her a deep cold week was coming. The south and west wall's pitch outer face had weathered over 5 winters since the cabin's construction in 1882. The pitch had chalked at the edges. The 1882 date she had carved beneath the 8-pointed Vosmikonichny crest, Pomortsy cross on the south lintel, was beginning to blur. It was time, before the great cold came down, before the wind pushed the thermometer below the level where even pitch would harden to stone, she would lay the second coat pitch on the south wall. She would seal the cabin one more time. On the morning of January 10th, 1888, she fired the Smolokurnya, The pine tar pit dug in the dooryard on the south side, downwind from the cabin. The pit was a shallow iron basin set into a brick and clay surround, with a pine wood fire burning beneath and a copper vessel suspended above on iron chains. Inside the vessel, 4 pounds of scraped pine heartwood from the stand of red pine stumps east of the claim. Deadfall from a storm-felled grove, dried 3 years, the heartwood resinous and rich. 6 hours of slow heat, never over 175 degrees Fahrenheit. Too hot, and the pitch would scorch and lose its elasticity. Too cool, and it would not render properly. And the pine pitch would come forth. That glossy, dark amber resin that would bond chemically to the tallow-saturated moss beneath and harden into the final protective skin. She had learned the pitch render from her father. Her mother, Marfa Anikova, had been a Valalshitsa, Vahliahel-Shchitsa, a wool felter, and had taught Praskoviya the clay and ash plaster work, the rye straw fiber, the burnishing stone. But the pitch was her father's craft entirely. The temperature had to be exact. Too hot, and the pitch would scorch and lose its elasticity. Too cool, and it would not fuse chemically with the tallow underneath. Her father had taught her to feel the heat in the air, to know by the smell of the pitch vapor when the moment was right. 60 years of log building in the Vyg River district had given Filaret Korovkin that knowledge. He had given it to his daughter before the Russian Empire shut down the Vyg River monastery in 1857, and before the persecutions came, and before the family had to flee. On January 10th and 11th, with the Smolokurna pit throwing up its constant thin smoke like a prayer rising, Praskoviya and Aksenti worked the south wall. She had mixed a fresh batch of toplonoye salo, toplionoye salo, rendered beef and mutton tallow the day before, boiling it slow in a copper pot to purify it, straining it through burlap to remove all impurities, storing it in a wooden firkin sealed with parchment. The tallow had to be pure because any impurity would weaken its adhesion to the moss. On the scaffold board, Aksenti held the pot while Praskoviya applied the warm tallow with a stiff hog bristle brush, saturating the already packed moss core in careful, even strokes. The tallow soaked into the sphagnum stems, locking them in place against migration and winter wind vibration, filling the micro-voids between the moss fibers. The tallow's vapor resistance would turn any interior condensation back toward the inner face, where the clay and ash plaster would breathe it away on dry days. This was the principle, not to block all vapor, but to manage it, to turn it, to make it move predictably through the wall. But why was the tallow the choice? Why not goose fat, which was cheaper and more abundant? Because goose fat would rancidify in 8 years, its molecular structure breaking down under the cycle of freeze and thaw. Because beef tallow, from cattle, had a crystalline structure that held stable through 30 winters of freeze-thaw, expanding and contracting with the wood, maintaining its bond. The sphagnum moss was the choice because its long, hollow, antimicrobial stems, hollow as quill pens, held the tallow in capillary suspension and resisted compaction under the weight of snow load over 30 winters. Loose hay would compress and decay in 3 winters. Rye straw would rot and harbor mice and insects. But sphagnum's natural antimicrobial chemistry, the same that had kept the Vyg River monastery's bog gardens fertile for 160 years, would hold against rot and moths. The long-leaf dovetail corner was the choice because the deeper bevel of the Russian Dliny list joint, deeper than the shallower Karelian half-dovetail, eliminated the cold bridge that wine-driven frost could knife through at the weakest angle. Each long-leaf dovetail joint also accepted a double-thickness wedge of moss and pitch that locked the corner thermally, sealing what might otherwise become a path for air infiltration. The Karelian corners of the eastern townships simply could not match that superior performance. The pitch was the final argument. The tallow saturator alone would weather to a chalk in 5 Dakota winters. The sun would bleach it. The wind would carry it away, grain by grain. But the pine pitch, the Smola sosnovaya, rendered from the heartwood of the northern red pines that had stood in the Vyg River bogs for 150 years before being felled. The pitch was the wind and snow shed membrane that made the whole system work. It bonded chemically to the tallow beneath. It shed water on contact. It breathed vapor in dry weather. It hardened to a flexible membrane that moved with the log's seasonal expansion without cracking. Praskoviya's father had shown her the geometry of it. 4 layers, not 3, because Dakota Territory was drier than the Vyg, and the dry cold would pull moisture from the wall differently than the wet cold of northern Russia. On January 11th, at dusk, when the second coat pitch was dry enough to accept carving, Praskoviya took a cold iron chisel and carefully carved the year 1882 beneath the 8-pointed Pomortsy cross on the south lintel. The cabin would hold. The year was marked. The covenant between the wall and the cold was renewed. Andrei, the eldest, 11 years old, had swung the Kanopatka caulking iron at the easier seams, learning the exact angle of the mallet strike that compressed without crushing the moss. Anna, the middle one, 8 years old, had carried the warm tallow pots up the scaffold board on a leather strap hung from her shoulders, steadying them with both hands so the saturator would not slosh. Lucaria, the youngest, 5 years old, had carried warm stones from the russkaya pech mass stove in her apron, setting them into the brass warming pot at the pitch render station, keeping the pitch flowing at the right heat. The 3 had been learning the work their whole lives, watching their father's hands before he fell ill, and now watching their mother's hands, learning the proportions, the angles, the feel of the work that would hold them alive through the winter. On the morning of January 12th, the pitch outer face glistened black. The cabin was ready. Praskoviya did not know what was coming, but her grandmother's barometer bone had been right before. The deep cold was coming. The wind was coming. The cabin would hold. At sunrise on January 12th, 1888, the Aberdeen Signal Service thermometer read 18 degrees Fahrenheit. A soft southerly breeze moved across the James River bottomland. The sky was pale blue. The weather was mild for Dakota Territory in January. Farmers walked their claims in shirt sleeves. They worked outdoors. Many one-room schools dismissed for early lunch. Praskoviya hung the wash on the south fence, clean wool underclothes, linen stockings, the dish rags, and let the russkaya pech mass stove fire die down to coals. She expected a mild day. At the Section 14 schoolhouse 3 miles east, Miss Cora Halverson, the Norwegian-American teacher, was 26 years old and had been teaching the one-room school for 4 years. 14 school children attended, 7 boys, 7 girls, ages 5 to 13, including Andrei, who was standing in for an absent older boy, Anna, and Lucaria Leskova. At 11:15 that morning, Miss Halverson dismissed the schoolhouse early for lunch. The school children ate cold biscuits outside in the open air, in their shirt sleeves. The sky was still blue. The wind was still soft. There was no warning in the air. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the polar front from the Saskatchewan Basin slammed across the northern plains. A black wall of cloud appeared in the north, advancing like a living thing. The temperature collapsed instantly. The wind came up to 60 miles per hour, then sustained at that velocity, then gusted higher. Whiteout snow filled the entire world. The visibility fell to less than 6 feet. At 1:40, Miss Cora Halverson made the decision that saved 14 lives. She did not send the school children out into the open prairie toward their individual homes. She had seen the weather turn like this before, once, and she had seen people lost on the prairie in the whiteout, walking in circles, their farms just 200 yards away, but invisible in the snow. She would not send them out. Instead, she tied them together with the schoolhouse window rope. Andrei was the strongest, so she put him at the front. She put Lucaria at the back, where the rope could steady her. The other 12 she arranged by size and strength between them. Then she gripped Andrei's hand, and they stepped out into the wind. 600 yards. That was the distance from the schoolhouse to Praskoviya's cabin. 600 yards across the open prairie in a 60-mile-per-hour wind, and a whiteout that erased the world. Miss Halverson had seen the cabin 2 days before, when she had ridden out to talk with Praskoviya about Anna's reading. She knew the bearing. She knew the cabin was there. She put her head down and walked. Behind her, tied together in a rope line like the crew of a ship in a gale, the 14 school children, ages 5 to 13, walked through the wind. The snow drove horizontal across the prairie. The air was already falling toward 0 degrees. They arrived at Praskoviya's south door at 2:25 in the afternoon. 14 school children and Miss Halverson, all alive, all uninjured, their faces white and their eyes large with the shock of survival. Praskoviya threw 3 more pine logs in the russkaya pech mass stove and started a 4-gallon kettle of kasha, sha, buckwheat porridge. She moved without hesitation, her hands knowing the work. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the temperature had fallen to 12 degrees below 0. Aksenti Belyaev arrived from his own claim half a mile north with frost-injured hands and a story of his neighbor Sigvald Hauge's frame house beginning to come apart. The wind was buckling the sheathing, peeling the walls away like bark from a tree. By midnight on January 12th, 22 souls were warm in Praskoviya's main room. The school children curled up on sheepskin rugs and wool blankets on the floor near the russkaya pech, their terror gradually ebbing as warmth returned to their small frames. Miss Halverson sat with her back against the north wall, where the pech radiated its heat into the room. Andrei stood at the firebox, helping his mother tend the fire. Anna helped Praskoviya with the kasha and the kvass, the fermented rye drink, and the medovukha, honey mead that warmed from the inside. Lucaria moved between the Molena corner shrine and the pech, her small hands carrying warm stones, her lips moving in the old believer prayers. Nastavnik Yosef Demidov sat with his hand-bound Chasovnik prayer book open on his lap, reading the evening prayers. Aksenti Belyaev and 3 other neighbors had arrived through the afternoon, drawn by the cabin's visible heat and light. The cabin held them all, warm and safe and alive. At sunrise on January 13th, the thermometer outside read 41 degrees below 0. The wind sustained at 60 miles per hour from the north-northwest, gusting higher. The visibility was under 6 feet, under 3 feet in the worst moments. The south wall of the cabin, the wall Praskoviya had finished with the second coat pitch 2 days before, held firm and steady. The interior surface of that wall measured 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The russkaya pech mass stove face measured 66 degrees. In a room of 22 people breathing and moving, the interior air held steady between 56 and 60 degrees. The pitch-sealed wall was the difference between life and death. Outside, the wind was erasing everything. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on January 13th, Lavinia Wells, the midwife, arrived by sleigh from Aberdeen. She had been at a bathrobe delivery the night before and had walked her exhausted draft team through the surge with a guide rope, following the fence line. She had brought a cooper's wife and a Welsh station master's wife with her. 3 more souls arrived at the cabin, bringing the number inside to 25. At 5 o'clock in the evening, a man stumbled to the south door. His face was blue-gray. His hands were black with frost, his breath barely moving. Praskoviya recognized him. Yefim Sokolov, a Russian peasant from her father's cousin's village, who had been working contract-thresh at the Drumheller bonanza. The bonanza had turned him out into the wind and cold. Praskoviya did not hesitate for a moment. She brought him in, sat him at the russkaya pech, and fed him kasha and rye bread and kvass, and slowly his hands began to warm. At 11 o'clock on January 14th, Lemuel Hoyt Drumheller himself arrived at Praskoviya's south door. He was riding in a borrowed Northwestern Mutual sleigh pulled by exhausted horses. His ear tips were black with frost. He was trying to reach his abandoned section stake survey camp at the southeast corner, a camp where, it was reported, his 3 contract laborers had already been found. They had not survived the night. Praskoviya did not turn him away. She gave him a place by the russkaya pech and set a kettle of warm kvass and rye bread on the hearth ledge. The silence between Praskoviya and Drumheller, while the south wall held and the russkaya pech radiated its heat into the room, lasted an hour. Neither of them spoke. The heat rose. The wall held firm. Outside, the wind was still erasing everything. The cold broke on January 14th. By nightfall, the thermometer was holding at -18 degrees. By January 15th, the daytime high had climbed to 4 degrees above zero. The wind was still moving, but it was no longer erasing the world. On January 16th, the Drumheller bonanza death toll reached 11. The Aberdeen Republican newspaper, edited by Frank Henry Haggerty, ran the count on the front page. Criminal negligence charges were proposed in a county board meeting. Drumheller's bunkhouse policy and the bonanza's contract labor conditions had become a public question. On January 22nd, Judge Hiram Augustus Bullard, the Brown County Territorial Circuit Judge, a Free Soil Republican from Vermont, signed an emergency injunction on petition of nastavnik Yosif Demidov, Aksenti Belyaev, and Miss Cora Halverson. The injunction halted Drumheller's quit-claim foreclosure on Praskoviya's claim. It ordered the bonanza to release the $80 in arrears wages that Tikhon had earned in 1886, plus $200 in mortuary damages to settle the estate's grievance. Drumheller's bookkeeper, Hezekiah Marsh, produced no objection. The law, for once, had sided with the widow. On January 24th, the Aberdeen Republican ran a front-page editorial titled "The Engineering Widow of Section 14." Haggerty, writing with the hand-felted wool scarf now hanging on his wife's shoulders at home, named Praskoviya's four-stratum moss tallow pitch caulking system specifically. He explained, in language that a farmer could understand, why the long leaf dovetail corners beat the Karelian half dovetail, why bog-moss beat loose hay, why rendered tallow beat goose fat, why pine pitch beat lime wash. He named her Praskoviya Filaretovna Leskova-Korovkina, not the Russian witch wife, not the pagan woman of the East Bottoms, but the engineer, the widow, the woman who had built something that held. The St. Paul Pioneer Press reprinted the editorial on January 27th, sending it to subscribers across Minnesota. The Chicago Tribune reprinted it on February 1st, sending it across the Midwest. By February, newspapers across the northern plains were talking about the Brown County Russian widow's cabin and the engineering widow's four-stratum caulking system, that system that had saved the schoolchildren's lives. The Aberdeen wheat combine began to fracture under public scrutiny. By February 18th, 3 of the 7 elevators had withdrawn, unwilling to carry the political weight of association with death and negligence. By March 21st, Drumheller's Northwestern Mutual Land Improvement Bond subscription on the Bonanza's spring expansion had failed to clear. He was forced to mortgage 2,400 acres at 9% to a New York syndicate, a far less favorable rate than he had anticipated. By spring, he had resigned the presidency of the Aberdeen Wheat Combine in quiet disgrace. On March 14, 1888, Praskoviya filed a Dakota Territory patent application for composite log seam caulking system with pitch outer face for northern cold climates. The patent was granted in 1889 as Dakota Territory Patent 1889-04-117. It was, to her knowledge, the first engineering patent filed by a Russian woman in Dakota Territory. Through the summer of 1888, 14 neighbor families, 6 Russian Old Believer, 4 Norwegian, 2 Bohemian, 1 Welsh, 1 Polish, recaulked their own cabin walls using Praskoviya's four-stratum moss-tallow pitch system. The nastavnik Yosef Demidov held an Old Believer house blessing for each completed cabin, marking the work with the Vosmikonichny crest 8-pointed cross in the lintel. Praskoviya taught freely, showing each builder the angle of the konopatka. Caulking iron, the feel of the tallow brush, the heat moment for pitch application. On November 2nd, 1889, Dakota Territory ceased to exist. North and South Dakota entered the Union. Section 14 fell in South Dakota. Praskoviya's quarter section, filed under Dakota Territory law in 1882, was now property of the state of South Dakota. In 1893, Andrei Tikhonovich Leskov, then 16 years old, completed a 4-year term at the Aberdeen Public School. He apprenticed to Aksenty Belyaev as a cooper and blacksmith. He learned the dovetail joint and the tallow render as a secondary craft, but cooperage and blacksmithing were his primary calling. In 1903, Anna Tikhonovna Leskova, then 23, a graduate of the Yankton Normal School, contributed to the South Dakota State Historical Society, quarterly a scholarly article titled "The Russian Old Believer Log House as a Vyg Tradition Vernacular in Eastern Dakota." The article cited Praskoviya's four-stratum caulking system as a significant adaptation of Pomortsy technique to the dry, cold climate of the northern Great Plains. In 1907, in the autumn, Praskoviya Filaretovna Leskova-Korovkina passed away of a fever at age 53. She was buried in the Russian Old Believer corner of the Brown County Immigrant Cemetery, not far from her beloved husband, Tikhon. The carved 8-pointed Vosmikonichny crest, Pomortsy, cross marks her grave, the same 8-pointed cross she had carved into the south lintel of the cabin 25 years before. The cabin she built, the Section 14 cabin with its squared red pine and tamarack logs, its long-leaf full-dovetail corners, its four-stratum moss tallow pitch caulking, stands restored at the Brown County Historical Site to this day. The carved 8-pointed cross in the south lintel is weathered but legible. The date carved beneath it, 1882, is still readable, the pitch-blacked log walls glistening in the sunlight, the russkaya pech mass stove standing on the north wall, whitewashed, its vaulted bake oven intact. The Molena corner shrine with its hand-carved copper crosses and its prayer book still resting on the shelf. The cottonwoods along the James River slough have grown to 80 feet. They stand over the cabin like witnesses, like a monument, like a prayer spoken in the wind.